we very much believe that the messages that are shared from the platform, as you call it, the front, should be relevant. They should be based in what the church and what the world is experiencing at the moment. They should be based on our own personal experiences. And they really should be based on what we believe as a leadership that God is speaking to us about. Because if we're not delivering messages about that, then I'm not quite sure what we're doing. And I want to make it very clear from the beginning that I am not making references to the current political landscape to tell you who I vote for, to tell you my opinion on politics. That is not what I want to do. So I'm not going to be criticizing or supporting, but I am going to bring some of the current political landscape into what I want to share this morning. Because for me, the last kind of month as we've entered this new era of politics with a new prime minister, there's been something that he's shared that's just really stuck with me. And it's made me question some stuff, and it's made me go, oh, that's really interesting. So as many of you will know, or maybe everyone will know, we've recently had Andy Burnham become our new prime minister, and he is the 7th prime minister in a decade. Now that in itself is quite an astounding fact. If you think about the political landscape historically, the fact that we are on the 7th prime minister in 10 years is quite astounding, and something that I never thought I would see in my life. And in his very first speech as Prime Minister, I don't know how many of you have watched that or listened to it, he led with a promise. He said, let us make this the moment where Britain starts to believe again, the moment we bring back hope. Let us make this moment when Britain starts to believe again, the moment we bring back hope. And it really got me thinking about that word, hope. And so that's what I want to talk to you about this morning, is hope. You see, if we look at society, if we spend any amount of time with people in our world at the moment, I really do get the sense that we're in a season of frustration. I think people are exhausted by instability, just that fact of how many prime ministers we've got. I think there's an exhaustion with people around instability. The cost of living crisis continues. It's not gone away. If anything, it's getting worse for people. There's a sense that things keep changing at the top, but they're not getting better underneath. There's promises that are made that are not fulfilled. And I see this in a lot of conversations in our community spaces when I spend time with people kind of out and about during the week, and I hear this sense of frustration, this sense of people that have just lost hope. And that's exactly the mood that the new Prime Minister has spoken into. He's spoken about this concept of bringing back hope. And that word hope is used in so many different ways in life, isn't it? Hope is used like, let's be honest, how many people recently have been like, we really need it to rain soon. I really hope it rains. A phrase that we never thought we'd hear in the UK. Maybe you're going somewhere new. I really hope there's somewhere to park. That's always my thing. I get very stressed out if I don't know where I'm going to park. I really hope there's a parking space. I really hope we have a great time at church this morning. But there can be a sense in our lives where we believe that a change in circumstances will bring back hope. A change in job, a change in relationship, a change in our health. And I do believe that in some way, we're all waiting for that moment sometimes. We have these periods in our lives where we're waiting for that moment where something changes and we can say, this is the moment where hope's going to come back. And I know for me in my own life, I've kind of clung to that hope of, I believe that something's going to change. I believe that my circumstances are going to change. And that's okay to do. I just want to make that really clear. That's okay. We all have those moments. It's okay to want things to change. It's okay to have hope in a better future than maybe our current circumstances are. But as I've been reflecting on what the new Prime Minister has been sharing, the reality is that while political hope and circumstantial hope is real and it matters, by its nature, it's a hope that keeps having to be rebuilt. And please don't hear what I'm not saying here. As Christians, we should absolutely care about our society. We should care about the government's desire for less poverty, more dignity, and a more hopeful national mood. We should be wanting to live in a society that has equality, where everyone has access to the things that meet their needs. We should look ahead. We should want our own circumstances and those of others to change for the better. What I'm sharing this morning isn't about dismissing that. However, as Christians, we've got to remind ourselves that this kind of hope is aimed at our circumstances, but actually the kind of hope that you and I need, that this world needs, goes way beyond that. It sits deeper than any of those things can ever reach. You see, the worldly definition of hope is this: it's to want something to happen or to be true, to cherish a desire with anticipation. And like I've said, those things aren't wrong, but let's look at biblical hope. Biblical hope is this: it is a strong and sure trust that God will do what he promised. Let me read that again. A strong and sure trust that God will do what he promised. Hebrews 6 verse 19 says this: we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. You see, an anchor doesn't move the storm. If you've got a boat that's anchored in a storm, it doesn't get rid of the storm. But what the anchor does is it holds you steady when you're inside it. And that's the claim of biblical hope for you and I. It's not the absence of hard circumstances, but it's the steadiness that brings when we're inside it. It's a confident expectation, and it's grounded in something incredible. It is grounded in the character. It's grounded in the track record of who God is. It's based on the evidence of his faithfulness. And in Hebrew, there's two main words that are translated hope. And they carry this sense of waiting expectantly, being stretched out towards something. It's the word behind Isaiah 40 verse 31 that says, those who wait in the Lord will renew their strength. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. It's not a passive waiting. It is a conscious choice to keep waiting for God to bring about a future that he's promised even before we can see it. That's the hope we have in God. Yakal, the other Hebrew word, carries a similar sense, but it often shows up in the middle of real difficulty. If you read Lamentations, one of those books that I don't think we're naturally drawn to, I don't think naturally we wake up and go, I'm just going to read Lamentations this morning. But it is a great book. And Lamentations 3:21 says this: yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. I will wait for him. You see, both of these Hebrew words, they point to something similar. They point to this idea that biblical hope isn't just a wishful thinking about an unknown future. You know, if we're honest, the political landscape at the minute, we've kind of all got this wishful thinking about an unknown future. We're hoping for something, but it's unknown. It's completely unknown what is going to happen in our world, in our nation. But biblical hope is never wishful thinking. It's remembering what God has already done. And it's the evidence of his faithfulness, and letting that be what motivates and sustains our hope for the future. And what I find really interesting is when we look back at the definition of biblical hope that we've just read, a strong and sure trust that God will do what he promised, what we see is this idea that trust and hope are wired together. They're wired together. And I was reflecting as I was preparing this, and I was thinking, well, can you hope without trust then? Can you trust without hope? Do we see them kind of pulling apart from each other? Do we see them integrating with each other? And I do wonder, when I look at kind of the political exhaustion that I've talked about, I wonder if it isn't really a failure of hope, it's more a failure of trust. You see, people, and it's not just in politics, but in the world and people's relationships, often we can see that when promises are broken, we don't trust. And so then you can't let yourself hope if you don't trust. Hope without trust in the person or thing you're hoping in means that it doesn't have anywhere to stand. And I was thinking about this in my own experiences. And I'm always really careful about how I talk about my experiences, because I'm very aware that this goes out to the world. And, one day my son could listen to this. And so I'm very careful. But if you think about it in terms of a relationship, for example, if you're married to somebody and they break your trust by doing something, whatever that thing is, and they say, I'm really sorry, I've broken trust, I've done something, I'm going to try harder. We all go, okay, great. But what happens if that person then doesn't do what they've said? And they break that trust again? What happens in that is that you lose hope that change is ever going to come. Because trust erodes, and once trust is gone, hope goes with it. And you can't keep hoping in someone you no longer trust. So I think actually the real question underneath all of this is, who or what are we actually trusting in our lives? Because I think that's what determines what hope has to stand on. And I want us to turn to Luke 22 this morning, and I want us to spend a little bit of time with one of the disciples. And we're going to spend a little bit of time with Peter. And he's also known in Scripture as Simon Peter or Simon. So if you notice that I'm now talking about Simon, don't panic. I have got the right person. But if you know anything about Peter, Peter was the confident one. He was the one who often he's described as the one who talks first and thinks second. I don't know if any of you can relate to that, but that's definitely me sometimes. And on the night before Jesus died, we've got this scene, we've got the Last Supper, haven't we, where all the disciples are around the table with Jesus. And at the Last Supper, Peter makes Jesus a huge promise, and he says, whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. And he says this in Luke 22:33, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. That's a bold claim, isn't it? Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Notice what he's putting on the line here. He's not just putting his reputation. He's not just saying, yeah, I'll kind of follow you, Jesus. He's giving his whole life. He's saying, whatever happens, I am with you. And I don't believe in that moment Peter was trying to, show off. I don't think he was trying to. I think he was really genuine in that moment. He meant every word of it. In that moment, that statement was true. Jesus, I am never going to go anywhere. I am with you wholeheartedly. And if we read on, Jesus' reply stops him in his tracks. Because Jesus' reply is that before the rooster crows the next morning, Peter, you're going to deny even knowing me. Not once, but 3 times. And we don't see Peter's reaction to that in Scripture. And sometimes I really wish we saw more of that in Scripture. Like, what was Peter's reaction in that moment where he's like, Jesus, I'm going to follow you to the death. And Jesus is like, you're going to deny me not once, but 3 times. I think if that was me, I think I'd be like, no, but Jesus, look at everything I've already done. Like, I try and defend myself. I'd be proving the times when I followed him, the fact that I'd given up everything. And I don't know what Peter's response was. We don't know. And unfortunately for Peter, things happened exactly as Jesus said. And so we're going to read Luke 22, 54 to 62 together. It says, then seizing him, which is Jesus, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. Man, I am not, Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is Galilean. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. He's very clear, isn't he? Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. I just want you to think, can you imagine that moment? You know, Jesus has been dragged away under arrest and he just turns and he looks at Peter. He just looks at him. He doesn't say anything. There's no words needed in that moment. And it's like that moment of, oh, I've just realized what I've done for Peter. And you see, this is what it can look like when actually hope kind of collapses in a moment. You see, Peter had staked his whole life on Jesus. And at that moment, Jesus needed him. But he denied even knowing him. And then silence. We don't hear in the Gospels a single word from Peter on the Saturday once Jesus has died. There's no dialogue, there's no scene, there's nothing. It's kind of, it's known as the darkest day. And I often think about what that day must have been like for the disciples, but I think most about what it must have been like for Peter. Knowing that it had this moment with Jesus where it said, I'm going to do anything for you, I'm going to follow you to death. Then he denies him 3 times, has this moment of realization, and then has to sit in that. And we then get to post-resurrection. The tomb is empty, Jesus is risen. The women go and tell the disciples the news, and there's a detail in this bit that's really easy to read straight past, and I feel like I've read this so many times. But it was only when I started to look at it for this morning that I saw something that I hadn't seen before. We see that the risen Jesus doesn't leave Peter in his own shame. He doesn't wait for him to come and apologize. He goes looking for him by name, and he meets him again by a charcoal fire later on in the chapter. And I think that matters because actually if we look back at the story when he denied Jesus, he was by a fire. It's almost like Jesus is recreating this scene. Here is where you denied me, but now we're going to recreate it and we're going to rewrite this story. And Jesus asked Peter the same question 3 times. He says, do you love me? And Peter's response is, of course I love you, Jesus. And Jesus tells him the same thing every time, feed my sheep. You see, Jesus doesn't just forgive this moment of collapsed hope for Peter. He rebuilds Peter's whole future on the other side of it. Later on in Acts, we see Peter is the man who is standing up and preaching boldly to thousands at Pentecost. The man who denied Christ becomes the man who proclaims him. And decades on, that same Peter, now an old man, writing to the persecuted, scattered believers who have every earthly reason to despair, he opens his letter to them with the very words his own story has already proved true. There is hope. 1 Peter 3 says, in his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And actually in this verse, the Greek word that is used for hope is elpis. And in everyday Greek, it could mean nothing more than a hopeful guess. But in the New Testament, it gets turned into something much stronger, a confident expectation anchored to one specific event, and that is this, the risen Jesus. You see, elpis isn't hope in general terms. It stands or falls on whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. And that's exactly why Peter can call it a living hope. It's a hope with a source. It's not just a feeling. It's a hope that is dependent on the fact that Jesus died and rose again. And I don't believe that Peter picked that word by accident when he was writing that letter, because he's not just talking about a hope that might come if things go well. He's talking about a living hope, hope that's got a pulse, hope that has already survived death itself because it's tied to the resurrection. You see, political hope and worldly hope says things could get better if the plan works, if the economy turns, if this leader delivers what the last leader couldn't. Living hope says it's already happened. The decisive thing has already happened. Death has already been beaten. The tomb is already empty. It isn't a hope that's waiting to be proven. It's resting on something that is already finished. And that's the hope that you and I live in, a hope that is grounded in something that has already happened. So we don't need to be wishful thinkers. We don't need to be these people that are wondering if it's going to be okay, because we have a living hope that is grounded on something that is already finished. He said on the cross, "It is finished." It doesn't wear out when a government changes. It doesn't wear out when news cycle changes. It doesn't wear out when your circumstances don't improve. It's an alive hope because he is alive, and that is good news for you and I. I wonder if the band can come up and join us. And it's always good, isn't it, to think about, so what does this mean for you and I going from this place this morning? Yes, we live in this living hope. We know that it is firm and secure because it is based on something that's already happened. That's why Peter could stand and say what he said. And I was thinking about, in life, so many of us have encountered situations where maybe we've described our own situations as hopeless. Or maybe you've been told you are hopeless, or you've spoken that over yourself. And I wonder what it would look like to hold these things that we encounter next to a living hope. Having this understanding that these things are real, they're experiences. But what does it mean for us to view those in light of the fact that we have the foundation of a living hope? What would it look like this week to hold both things at once? To understand that we are living in uncertain times and people are experiencing a lack of hope. To hold the tension of seeing what is going on in our world and wanting it to shift and wanting it to change, whilst refusing to let that be where our hope lies. And that's a tension that's hard. Like we've already said, Lamentations talks a lot into this, and it says, "This I call to mind, therefore I have hope." Maybe that's one simple thing to do this week when you feel maybe you're so aware of what is going on in our world that sometimes it does feel hopeless. But I would encourage you to write down the things that God has done in your life. The faithfulness that you've seen him do. And maybe if you struggle to do that, go to someone else and say, "Hey, I'm struggling right now to see hope in this hopeless world. I need some hope sharing." And maybe they can share something with you that brings that hope. We're starting to record as a church some testimonies from people that we're going to be sharing over the coming months. Because when hope feels like it's failing, hearing stories of what God is doing of people is so encouraging. And the first one's going to be out in the next couple of weeks, and it's Danielle's story of her health battles over the last year. And when we recorded it, it was just this beautiful moment of her just sharing of how God has pulled her through a really difficult year. And so we're going to sing to finish together, and we're going to sing Living Hope. Because what I want us to do as a church this morning is I want us to be able to stand and declare together that whatever is going on in our world, that we are confident in the living hope that we have, because we know that he has already overcome everything. So if you're able, why don't you stand with me? And Liz and the team are going to lead us as we sing.